The cold did not merely settle over northwest Greenwood. It hunted. Clara Vogler stood beneath the creaking wooden awning of Caldwell's General Store, her fingers frozen into stiff aching hooks inside her thin wool pockets as she stared at the final 45 cents she possessed. 11 miles of jagged Main Mountain Road lay ahead, choked by the scent of rotting pine and the sharp metallic tang of an incoming winter that promised to be merciless. If she stayed on this porch, the frost would claim her by morning. If she walked into the timber, the shadows might do it sooner. Her father was dead, her family's New York orchard stolen by a fraudulent lien, and this barren stretch of New England was her last desperate gamble for survival. She pulled her hand from her pocket, her skin red and chapped from the biting wind, and reached for the water-stained piece of paper tacked to the store's cedar post. Her thumb smudged the fading ink as she tore it free. Harvest and winter prep. Help needed. Blackwood Farm, 11 miles northwest. Room and board. Inquire with purpose. S. Vance. It was a lifeline thrown into a freezing void. Folding the paper with practiced care, she tucked it into the lining of her frayed coat, picked up her small wicker trunk tied with rotting hemp rope, and set her cracked boots onto the frozen mud of the road. The 11-mile trek into the mountains was a lesson in isolation. The omniscient eye of the wilderness watched her progress, a lone, fragile speck of blue wool against an immense canvas of granite peaks and towering, suffocating pines. To an outsider, Clara looked like a victim of circumstance, a helpless girl driven to madness by grief. But beneath the faded shawl lay the mind of an orchardist's daughter, a woman who knew how to read the rings of a tree and the subtle shifts in the mountain air. As she climbed higher, she noticed the crows flying unusually low, their dark wings cutting through a sky that had turned the color of a bruised plum. The wind was backing from the northeast, growing heavier, dense with unfallen ice. The mountain was preparing to lock its gates. By the time the iron gates of Blackwood Farm appeared through the swirling gray mist, the afternoon light had died completely. The homestead was a stark, unpainted two-story structure that looked as though it had grown directly out of the rocky earth, weathered and beaten by decades of gales. Rows of gnarled northern spy apple trees flanked the property, their branches bare and twisting toward the sky like desperate hands. In the center of the yard, illuminated only by the dull glow of a dying lantern, a broad-shouldered man was engaged in a silent, furious battle with a broken wagon axle. This was Silas Vance. The narrator, possessing total knowledge of the grief that rotted the interior of the Blackwood house, saw the heavy burden Silas carried. 3 years ago, a winter fever had taken his wife Helen, leaving him with an empty bed, an 8-year-old son who had forgotten how to speak, and a mountain of debt that grew larger with each passing frost. Silas worked with a reckless, self-destructive energy, his bare hands bloodied from the cold steel of the jack, his jaw set in a permanent grimace against the world. When the crunch of Clara's boots on the frozen gravel broke the silence, Silas did not look up immediately. He wiped his bloody brow with a stiff canvas sleeve, his gray eyes sweeping over her thin frame, her trembling chin, and the pathetic wicker trunk at her feet. "I don't hire women," Silas said, his voice flat, gravelly, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Toby is out in the north pasture trying to round up the strays, and I need a man who can swing a broadaxe and haul cedar logs. I don't need another mouth to feed when the blizzard set in." He turned back to the wagon, dismissive, closing the door on her existence, just as her uncle had done a month prior. But Clara did not turn back toward the freezing road. She stood her ground, her gaze locking onto the side of his weathered face. "You won't have until the blizzard set in, Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady despite the shivering of her limbs. "You don't have weeks, you have less than 12 hours. Silas paused, his wrench freezing against the iron nut. He slowly stood up to his full height, towering over her, a dark shadow against the white mist. "What are you talking about, girl?" "The wind is backing from the northeast, and the atmospheric pressure is dropping faster than a lead weight," Clara replied, pointing a steady finger toward the purple peaks above them. "The crows are roosting early, and the bark on your northern spy trees is weeping sap. A nor'easter is rolling over the ridge tonight. If you leave that wagon broken and your livestock unhoused, the frost will kill your cattle before dawn, and your remaining harvest will rot on the branch. You don't need a man to swing an axe today, Mr. Vance. You need someone who knows how to save a farm from the ice." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind through the bare apple orchard. Silas stared at her, searching her face for weakness, for falsehood. What he found instead was the unbreakable iron of a person who had already looked into the eyes of ruin and refused to blink. He looked at her cracked boots, then up at the darkening sky, realizing with a bitter jolt that the girl was entirely correct. The mountain was turning against him, and he was completely alone. "The room off the kitchen is drafty," Silas muttered, wiping his bloody hands on a rag as he picked up his lantern. "There's a small stove, but you'll have to cut your own kindling. Wages are $3 a week plus board. If you survive the night, we talk about tomorrow." He walked toward the house without waiting to see if she followed, but Clara did not hesitate. She picked up her trunk, her heart beating with the first throb of warmth she had felt in weeks. She had found a foothold on the mountain. As she stepped into the dim, freezing kitchen of the Blackwood homestead, the door clicking shut behind her against the rising gale, Clara realized she was not alone. Sitting at the long, scarred oak table in the shadows was a small boy, Leo Vance. He clutched a chipped tin cup with both hands, his large, hollow eyes watching her from beneath a shock of untamed dark hair. There was an intense, painful longing in the boy's gaze, a hunger for a mother's touch that had been denied him for 3 long years, but it was buried deep beneath a wall of profound suspicion. Clara set her trunk down quietly, meeting the boy's stare with a gentle, unhurried nod. Outside, the first heavy flakes of the nor'easter began to violently lash against the glass, a terrifying promise of the trial that awaited them all in the dark hours to come. The storm did not merely arrive. It broke over Blackwood Farm like a heavy iron cage falling from the sky. By 4 in the morning, the omniscient shadows of the valley were swallowed entirely by a blinding, shrieking sheets of white. Inside the house, the walls groaned under the immense atmospheric weight of the nor'easter, the timbers popping like pistol shots as the temperature plummeted toward 0. In his room, Silas Vance lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, his chest tight with a familiar suffocating dread. His mind traveled through the frozen floorboards to the small room off the kitchen where Clara Vogler slept. He had expected her to cry herself to sleep, or to pack her meager things and slip away into the dark, but the house had remained entirely quiet. Silas sat up, rubbing his face with his calloused palms, the ghosts of his past crowding the corners of his mind. 3 years had passed since his wife Helen had taken her last breath in this very house, her hand turning ice cold in his as a winter fever claimed her. Since that night, Silas had treated the farm as a fortress and a prison, refusing to let anyone close enough to witness his slow, agonizing ruin. He was drowning in debt, his equipment was failing, and the predatory whispers of Edgar Miller were growing louder with every passing month. Silas had convinced himself that isolation was the only way to protect his son Leo. Yet as he pulled on his stiff leather boots, he knew that the storm outside was a physical manifestation of the ruin he had been running from. A sudden terrifying sound ripped through the howling wind, a sharp splintering crack that echoed from the direction of the lower barn. Silas bolted down the stairs, his lantern swinging wildly, only to find Clara already waiting by the back door. She had wrapped her mother's faded blue wool shawl tightly around her head and shoulders, her jaw set, her eyes reflecting the pale, fierce light of the lantern. "The main barn," Clara said, her voice cutting through the roar of the gale. "The weight of the ice is pulling the ridgepole down. If that roof gives way, your livestock and the remaining apple crates are gone." Silas didn't argue. He threw open the door, and the winter hit them like a physical blow. The air was a swirling vortex of ice needles that tore at their skin and choked their breath. They fought their way across the yard, their boots sinking knee-deep into the heavy, shifting drifts. Toby, the young hired hand, was already inside the barn, his face pale with terror as he held a lantern toward the ceiling. High above the trembling horses, the massive oak support beam was bowing outward, a deep, jagged fissure spreading along its grain with a sickening creak. "It's going to drop," Toby shouted, his voice cracking as he backed toward the exit. "We have to get out of here, Mr. Vance. The whole loft is coming down." "Get the horses out!" Silas roared back, lunging toward the timber, instinctively trying to brace his own broad shoulders against a heavy cedar post to stabilize the structure. It was an act of pure, stubborn desperation. The oak beam groaned louder, dropping an inch, pinning Silas beneath its shifting weight as his boots slid on the ice-covered dirt floor. He was trapped, his muscles straining to the breaking point, his eyes wide as he realized his strength alone could not defy the mountain. "Toby, stand your ground!" Clara's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative, completely devoid of panic. She didn't look at the falling roof. She looked at the geometry of the structure. She scrambled across the stalls, grabbing a heavy mechanical car jack from the broken wagon parts and a thick length of timber her father had taught her to use for leverage. "Mr. Vance, don't move. Toby, take the base of this post. When I lift, you drive the wedge home. Clara wedged the timber beneath the fracturing oak beam, her small hands gripping the iron handle of the jack. Her muscles burned, her skin tearing against the freezing metal, but she poured every ounce of her anger, her grief, and her survival into the lever. With a brutal mechanical groan, the jack extended. The crushing weight shifted off Silas's shoulders by a mere fraction of an inch, but it was enough. "Now, Toby!" Clara screamed. The young boy, galvanized by her fierce certainty, swung a heavy mallet, driving a cedar wedge deep into the support joint. The beam settled onto the temporary brace with a dull, echoing thud. The roof stopped creaking. The barn held. Silas collapsed against the stall divider, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he stared at Clara. Her breath rose in thick white plumes, her face smudged with soot and grease, her hands bleeding through her torn gloves. In the total silence of the barn, save for the nervous shifting of the horses, Silas saw her clearly for the first time. She was not a burden. She was an anchor holding his dissolving world in place. By the time they fought their way back into the kitchen, the storm had reached its peak, sealing the windows with thick crusts of frost. The interior of the house was freezing, the air so cold it hurt to swallow. In the corner of the hearth sat Leo, shivering violently, his small hands uselessly scratching a flint against a pile of damp birch kindling. The boy was crying silently, terrified by the sounds of the storm and the fear of being left entirely alone in the dark. Clara did not hesitate. She knelt beside the boy, gently taking the flint from his numb fingers. "The wood is wet, Leo," she said, her voice dropping into a low rhythmic cadence that seemed to soothe the howling wind outside. "But look here. If you scrape the dry bark from the underside of the log, it catches the spark every time. My father showed me that when the New York winters got heavy. Watch the smoke." Silas watched from the doorway as Clara coaxed a tiny, fragile orange tongue of fire from the hearth. She carefully fed the flame until the kitchen was bathed in a deep amber glow, chasing the terrifying shadows back into the corners. Without being asked, she moved to the dry larder, gathering the remaining salted pork, a handful of dried beans, and 3 wrinkled winter potatoes. Within an hour, the heavy iron kettle on the stove was bubbling, filling the barren house with the rich, savory aroma of a thick soup. They ate at the long oak table in a heavy, reverent silence. Silas swallowed the hot broth, feeling the life return to his limbs, though his eyes never left Clara's face. She sat opposite him, her head bowed as she carefully used a bone needle to mend a deep tear in Leo's woolen stocking. Leo had moved his chair closer to hers, his small shoulder almost touching her blue shawl, his large eyes tracking the steady, rhythmic movement of her fingers. For 3 years, this kitchen had been a place of unspoken grief and cold meals. Tonight, the fire was hot, the food was real, and the boy was no longer looking at the floor. As Clara pulled the thread tight, she glanced out the window at the white fury of the Maine night. She knew the barn would hold for now, but the ledger on the desk told a grim story. The food would run out before the snow melted, and Edgar Miller would return when the roads cleared. She had saved the barn, but to save the family, she would have to find a way to break the isolation of the valley itself. A thought that weighed heavily on her as she watched the embers die. By the middle of January, the mountains of northwest Greenwood had ceased to be a landscape and had become a siege. 4 feet of packed slate-colored snow locked the valley in a silence so absolute that the snap of a frozen pine branch could be heard a mile away. At Blackwood Farm, the daily routine had shrunk to a grueling battle against the frost. Every morning, Silas and Toby hacked through 3 inches of solid ice just to reach the well water, their breath freezing into white crusts on their wool collars. From the omniscient heights of the ridge, the homestead looked entirely swallowed. A tiny curl of gray wood smoke, the only evidence that life still flickered beneath the heavy white drifts. Inside the house, a different kind of quiet had taken root. The terror of the nor'easter had passed, but in its wake lay the cold reality of survival. Clara stood in the dim subterranean chill of the root cellar, her lantern casting long dancing shadows across the near-empty slatted bins. Her father had always said that a real farmer doesn't look at the sky to see winter. He looks at his cellar floor. What Clara saw now made her stomach tighten. The barrels of salted pork were down to the brine, the sacks of flour had flattened, and the remaining northern spy apples were beginning to wrinkle their sweet scent, turning sharp and alcoholic. They had enough to survive February, perhaps, but March in Maine was a cruel illusion. a month of frozen mud and false thaws that devoured provisions. Upstairs, Silas sat at the kitchen table, his ledger open beneath the weak yellow light of an oil lamp. The omniscient perspective revealed the heavy circular nature of his thoughts. His pride was a physical weight, an inheritance from a father who had carved this farm out of the granite hills with nothing but an iron spade and a stubborn refusal to beg. Silas knew the larders were emptying. He knew the horses were dreaming of sweet grass while chewing on dry corn husks. Yet the thought of riding into town to ask for credit or worse, knocking on a neighbor's door with an empty sack, felt like a betrayal of his own skin. He would rather starve in the dark than let the valley see him break. Clara understood his pride because she had seen it ruin men before. She did not confront him. Instead, she took his quietness and turned it into purpose. The next morning, before the sun could even tint the eastern peaks, a dull orange, Clara wrapped her mother's blue wool shawl around her face, tied her boots with fresh twine, and stepped out into the waist-high drifts. She walked 2 miles through the suffocating white silence to the neighboring property of Mrs. Weaver, an elderly widow, whose husband had been buried in the churchyard before Leo was born. Mrs. Weaver was a woman hardened by decades of New England winters, a cynic who viewed outsiders with the cold suspicion of a crow's guarding a cornfield. When she opened her heavy oak door to find Clara standing on her porch, her face frozen into a mask of red-chapped skin, she did not invite her in. "If you're here looking for charity for Silas Vance, you can turn right back around," Mrs. Weaver said, her voice like grinding stones. "The Vances have been too proud to look a neighbor in the eye for 3 years. If Silas wants to starve on that hill, that's his business." Clara did not flinch from the old woman's glare. She leaned against the porch railing, her voice steady and clear in the freezing air. "I'm not here for charity, Mrs. Weaver. I'm here for a trade. Silas Vance has 2 strong arms, a broad axe, and a team of horses that need to work to keep their legs from freezing. Your north chimney is choked with creosote, your woodpile is buried under 5 feet of ice, and your barn roof needs the snow scraped before the next heavy wet drop splits the rafters. I have a ledger right here." Clara pulled the small leather book from her coat. "We give you 20 hours of hard labor a week. In return, you give us 2 barrels of your surplus flour and a side of smoked beef from your cellar. It's a covenant, Mrs. Weaver, not a handout." The old woman stared at the young girl, her sharp blue eyes tracking the absolute certainty in Clara's posture. For the first time in years, someone had approached her not with pity or neglect, but with the practical arithmetic of survival. By noon, the deal was struck. Within a week, Clara had visited 3 more isolated homesteads in the upper valley, weaving a quiet web of mutual reliance across the snowbound hills. The Blackwood larders began to fill again, not through the humiliation of charity, but through the honest currency of sweat and coordination. Silas worked until his shoulders bled, his pride intact, because Clara had framed his labor as a necessity for the whole valley. But the peace earned through the covenant was fragile, and the wilderness was not the only predator watching Blackwood Farm. In early February, during a rare afternoon when the sun shone with a brilliant blinding glare off the snowfields, the sharp jingle of silver harness bells broke the silence of the yard. A heavy, black-painted cutter sleigh pulled up to the porch, its twin horses breathing plumes of steam into the crisp air. From beneath a mountain of thick bearskin robes stepped Edgar Miller, the town speculator. He did not knock. He flung the kitchen door open, stomping his expensive polished leather boots on the clean floorboards that Clara had scrubbed only that morning. The scent of expensive tobacco and pomade filled the room, a jarring artificial intrusion into the honest smell of wood smoke and dried sage. Leo immediately shrank into the shadow of the pantry, his large eyes wide with an old, remembered terror. Silas rose slowly from the hearth, his hand tightening around the handle of the iron poker, his body instantly stiffening into a posture of defense. "Beautiful day for a drive, Silas," Miller said, his smile tight and superficial as he unbuttoned his wool coat. He didn't look at Silas. His eyes swept over the newly mended chairs, the full wood box, and the aromatic pot of stew simmering on the stove. He smelled the changing tide of the house, and he did not like it. He threw a heavy, cream-colored legal document onto the scarred oak table. "But I'm not here for the scenery. The county clerk signed the final notices yesterday. You're 3 years behind on the equipment loans your father took out, and the back taxes on the lower pasture have defaulted to my firm. You have until April 1st to vacate the property, Silas. Unless, of course, you want to be reasonable." Silas stared at the paper, the color draining from his weathered face. his knuckles turned white against the iron poker. "The lower pasture is where the spring runoff feeds the orchard, Miller. If you take that, the trees die by June. You're killing the whole farm." "I'm exercising my legal rights," Miller replied, his voice smooth and cold as river ice. "But I'm a generous man. Sign over the timber rights to the old-growth pines on the North Ridge today and give up your water access to the Greenwood Creek and I'll erase the debt. You can keep the house and the barn. You can stay here and scratch out a living on the rocks. If not, the sheriff will be here with the horses when the road's clear." Silas looked down at his own boots, a terrible crushing weight settling into his chest. He was an orchardist, a man who understood soil and storms, but the complex, ink-woven traps of the town lawyers were a language he could not speak. He felt the legacy of his father slipping through his fingers like dry sand. He looked at Leo, who was trembling in the shadows, and for a fleeting, horrifying second, Silas thought about reaching for the pen. "Let me see that," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it had the sharp ringing clarity of an axe striking hardwood. She stepped out from the pantry shadow, her apron stained with flour, and picked up the heavy document before Miller could stop her. Miller scoffed, dismissing her with a wave of his gloved hand. "This is legal business, girl. Go back to your pots." Clara ignored him entirely. Her eyes moved down the dense, tightly packed lines of text with the rapid surgical precision of a woman who had spent her youth helping her father dissect fraudulent land claims in New York. The narrator, possessing the full truth of her past, saw the ghost of her father standing behind her, guiding her fingers to the fatal flaw in the speculator's trap. "This document references an 1890 boundary survey, Mr. Miller." Clara said, her thumb resting against a specific paragraph on the third page. She looked up, her gaze locking onto Miller's face with a cold, predatory intensity that mirrored his own. "But you know as well as I do that the state of Maine revised the riparian water rights for the Greenwood Valley in 1912. Private firms cannot claim exclusive access to a natural creek runoff if it alters the agricultural viability of an established homestead upstream. It's an illegal clause." Miller's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing into two dark slits. "You don't know what you're talking about, outsider. I know that if you file this foreclosure in the county court in Augusta, the judge will throw it out before the ink dries." Clara continued, stepping closer to him, her voice rising with an unbreakable authority. "And more than that, Mr. Miller, the families of this valley have spent the last month working together. If you try to bring a sheriff up this mountain to evict Silas Vance based on an outdated survey, you won't just be fighting him. You'll be explaining your fraudulent bookkeeping to Mrs. Weaver and every farmer from here to the ridge. I suggest you take your paper back to town and consult a better lawyer." The silence in the kitchen became absolute. Miller looked from Clara's iron gaze to Silas, who had stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared, a new, fierce light burning in his gray eyes. The predator realized he had lost the element of surprise. The isolated valley was no longer isolated. With a muffled curse, Miller snatched the document from the table, buckled his coat, and stormed out into the blinding white yard, the slam of the heavy oak door shaking the frost from the window panes. As the jingle of the cutter bells faded into the distance, Silas turned to Clara. He didn't speak immediately. The gratitude inside him was too large for his throat. He looked at her small, calloused hands, the hands that had held the jack in the barn and the pen against the speculator, and he realized that the winter had not brought a burden to his house. It had brought a savior. Leo crept out from the pantry, his small hand reaching out to touch the corner of Clara's blue shawl. The boy looked up at her, the suspicion completely gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, reverent awe. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, whistling through the bare apple trees, but inside the kitchen the fire felt hotter, and the walls of Blackwood Farm felt thicker than they ever had before. Clara gently patted the boy's head, her eyes meeting Silas's gaze over the amber light of the hearth. Both of them knowing that while the first battle had been won, the true test would come with the April thaw. By the first week of April, the heavy, suffocating silence that had held Northwest Greenwood captive for 5 months finally broke. It began not with a sudden shift in the wind, but with a deep subterranean roar as the massive ice packs on the upper ridges began to crack. From the omniscient heights of the mountain, the valley looked like a great gray beast shaking off its winter shroud. Silver brooks swollen with melted snow rushed violently down the granite slopes, cutting through the muddy earth and filling the air with the raw, sweet scent of damp soil and awakening pines. At Blackwood Farm, the gnarled branches of the northern spy apple trees were no longer bare. Tiny, pale green buds were beginning to push through the dark bark, holding the quiet promise of the harvest to come. The morning sun had just cleared the eastern peaks when Toby rode into the yard, his horse's hooves churning the thick spring mud. He was splattered from boots to collar, but his face was split by a wide, breathless grin as he waved a heavy parchment envelope with a red wax seal. Silas Vance stepped out onto the porch, his hand instinctively coming down to rest on Leo's shoulder. Clara stood just behind them in the doorway, her mother's blue wool shawl draped loosely over her arms, her heart catching in her chest as she recognized the official markings of the county courthouse in Augusta. Silas took the envelope, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he tore the seal. The omniscient eye, tracking the months of silent terror and legal maneuvering that had led to this moment, read the elegant script before Silas could finish the first line. The written affidavits that Clara had meticulously organized throughout the winter, signed by Mrs. Weaver and 4 other respected families of the Upper Valley, had done their work. The county judge had reviewed the 1912 riparian water rights and stripped Edgar Miller's firm of any legal claim to the lower pasture. The debt was restructured under a state agricultural extension, and the predatory foreclosure notice was officially dismissed. The land was safe. The shadow that had hung over the Vance family since Helen's death had been permanently lifted. Silas let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a prayer. The tension that had held his shoulders rigid for 3 years finally dissolving into the spring air. He looked down at the paper, then turned slowly to look at Clara. There were no words large enough in his vocabulary to match the gratitude that filled his chest, but the sudden brilliant warmth in his gray eyes spoke for him. The transformation of Blackwood Farm over the next 3 weeks was absolute. The unpainted wood of the homestead seemed to catch the spring light differently now that the interior was filled with life. Toby worked with a fierce, joyful energy, clearing the winter debris from the drainage ditches and prepping the tractor for the spring plowing. The barn roof, braced so desperately by Clara's hands during the height of the nor'easter, had been permanently reinforced with fresh oak timbers traded from Mrs. Weaver's lot. The community cellar covenant that Clara had woven through the frozen hills had not vanished with the snow. It had evolved into a permanent bond between neighbors who had looked into the eyes of ruin together and survived. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, the air thick with the scent of wild sage and apple blossoms, the true victory of the winter became manifest. Leo was running through the kitchen garden, his bare feet digging into the rich black earth as he chased a rogue brown hen that had escaped the coop. His untamed dark hair flew in the wind, and suddenly a sound ripped through the yard that made both Silas and Clara stop their work. It was a laugh. It was a loud, clear, unburdened sound bubbling up from the chest of an 8-year-old boy who had forgotten how to smile. Silas stood by the newly repaired cedar fence, his axe resting against his boot, as he watched his son slide through the mud to scoop the protesting chicken into his arms. Tears pricked the corners of the rugged farmer's eyes, and he didn't wipe them away. He had not heard that sound since the day he buried his wife. He had thought the winter of his life would last forever, but looking at his son now, he knew the frost was completely gone. Clara walked out to the fence carrying a woven basket of spring seedlings she had started by the kitchen hearth. She stood beside Silas, her eyes soft as she watched Leo carry the hen back toward the coop, Anna Weaver's young granddaughter running alongside him and shouting instructions. Silas turned to Clara, his hand moving across the rough cedar railing to cover hers. His grip was warm, steady, and entirely sure. "The day you walked up that mountain road with nothing but a broken wicker trunk, I told you I didn't hire women," Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly timbre that was thick with emotion. "I told you this mountain killed the weak. I was a fool, Clara, a blind, stubborn fool." Clara smiled, her fingers twisting to interlock with his. "You were a man trying to protect his son from a storm he couldn't see, Silas. There is no foolishness in that. You saved the barn, and you broke Miller's back." Silas continued, stepping closer to her, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a profound, quiet reverence. "But you did something more than that. You brought the light back into this house. You taught my boy how to laugh again. I don't want to hand you an envelope of wages at the end of the week anymore, Clara. I don't want you to be the help. I want you to be the heart of this place. I want you to be my wife if you can tolerate a man who still has a lot of winter left to melt out of him." Clara looked away for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the kitchen garden. She saw the crooked bean rows that Leo had proudly helped her plant, the wild sage she had transplanted from the creek, and the old tin garden markers from Helen Vance's time, that she had carefully moved to the east wall of the barn where the morning sun would always strike them first. They were still there. They belonged. She thought of her father's hands in the soil of a New York farm that no longer existed, a place she would never see again. She remembered his voice echoing through her memory during her darkest hours on the frozen road. The earth gives up its frost if you ask it patiently. She looked back into Silas's eyes, her thumb tracing the rough skin of his knuckles. "I'm asking patiently," she whispered, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of a woman who had fought the mountain and won. The afternoon went on around them, warm, green, and entirely ordinary. Leo's laughter drifted across the yard from the coop, a steady, beautiful rhythm that matched the spinning of the wooden windmill against the blue Maine sky. Clara pulled her mother's blue shawl tight around her shoulders one last time, not against the cold, but to hold the memory close as she stepped off the porch and walked into the house. Supper had to be made, the seedlings had to be planted, and there was still work to do. There would always be work to do. But as the door clicked shut against the gentle spring breeze, Clara Vogler knew she was no longer wandering. She was finally home.